3 hours after my little sister married a prince, someone pounded so hard on my front door that my golden retriever Daisy jumped off the couch barking. When I looked through the peephole, 6 men in dark dress uniforms stood perfectly still in my driveway. One of them looked straight at the door and said, "Miss Margaret Collins, His Majesty requests your presence immediately." For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I'd fallen asleep in front of the television. My name is Margaret Collins, but everyone has called me Maggie since I was a little girl. I'm 40 years old, and I teach 11th grade English at Asheville High School in Asheville, North Carolina. I live in a modest 3-bedroom ranch house that still has the original oak floors from the early 70s. It isn't fancy, but it's home. Every Saturday morning I buy tomatoes and peaches at the North Asheville Tailgate Market, then stop by Ingles for groceries before heading back to grade essays with Daisy stretched across my feet. It's a simple life, one I used to think my little sister appreciated. That Saturday had started like any other. I woke up just before 7, brewed a pot of Folgers coffee, and carried my favorite blue mug onto the back porch. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass after a light overnight rain. My roses along the fence had finally started blooming, and for a few minutes I convinced myself it was going to be an ordinary day. Of course it wasn't. It was Olivia's wedding day. The whole country seemed to know about it. Every news station had been talking about Prince Alexander of Norhaven marrying an American woman. There were helicopters over Boston commentators discussing royal traditions, and magazine covers lined up at every checkout lane in town. Everyone knew. Except most people didn't know that the bride had an older sister. Or maybe they did. Maybe they just assumed I wasn't important enough to mention. I turned the television off before breakfast. I didn't want to watch. Not because I wasn't happy for Olivia. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The truth was a little more complicated. Our mother died when I was 20. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. Olivia had just turned 14. She cried herself to sleep almost every night for months. Dad tried his best, but less than a year later he suffered a massive stroke that left his right side weak. He never fully recovered. I had been accepted into graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill. I never went. Instead, I stayed home. Someone had to keep the mortgage paid. Someone had to drive Olivia to volleyball practice. Someone had to remind her about homework, dentist appointments, and college applications. That someone became me. I worked mornings at the public library shelving books, afternoons at a local bookstore, evenings waiting tables at Applebee's. Looking back now, I honestly don't know how I stayed awake. But somehow we made it. When Olivia graduated from high school, I cried harder than she did. When she got into NYU, I took out a second mortgage because financial aid wasn't enough. She hugged me outside the admissions office and whispered into my shoulder, "I'll never forget this, Maggie." I believed her. Years later, after Dad passed away, Olivia landed a job selling luxury real estate in Manhattan. She had a gift for talking to people. Within 5 years, she was closing deals worth millions. Designer clothes replaced thrift store sweaters. 5-star hotels replaced roadside motels. She started calling less often, then only on birthdays. Eventually, even birthdays became text messages. I tried not to take it personally. People get busy. Life changes. At least that's what I told myself. Then one afternoon last winter, Olivia called with exciting news. "I'm engaged." I nearly dropped the mixing bowl I was holding. "Engaged? His name is Alexander." "The prince?" She laughed. "The one and only." I was genuinely thrilled. It sounded ridiculous, a real prince, but she sounded happier than I'd heard in years. For weeks we talked about flowers, music, and dresses. Then, almost without warning, the conversation stopped. Whenever I called, someone from her assistant's office answered instead. Texts went unanswered. Months passed. Finally, elegant cream-colored wedding invitations began arriving at friends' houses. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, asked me over the fence one evening, "So when are you flying to Boston?" I smiled. "Next week, I guess." Inside, I hadn't received anything. I waited another week. Nothing. I figured it had been lost in the mail. That happens. So I called Olivia. She answered after 4 rings. "Maggie, I think my invitation got lost." Silence, long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she sighed. "It didn't." "I don't understand." "Maggie, this wedding is different." "Different how?" "There will be diplomats, royal families, heads of charities." I laughed nervously. "So, you won't fit in." The words landed harder than I expected. "I don't need to fit in. It's complicated. No Liv. I hadn't called her Liv in years. It's actually very simple. Another pause. Then she said the sentence I've replayed in my head more times than I can count. You're an embarrassment. Not loud. Not angry. Almost casual. Like she was commenting on the weather. I felt something inside me go strangely quiet. I raised you. I know. I loved you. I know. But this is my future. I didn't argue anymore. There wasn't anything left to say. She ended the call first. The week before the wedding, I kept expecting another call, an apology, an explanation. Nothing came. So on the morning she married Prince Alexander, I stayed exactly where she wanted me. Home. I watered my roses, folded laundry, made myself a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch. Around 1 o'clock, I pulled an old photo album off the shelf. There we were at Myrtle Beach, Olivia missing her 2 front teeth, Dad smiling before the stroke, Mom wearing the yellow sundress she loved. In every picture, I was standing just behind Olivia, ready to catch her if she fell. By 4 that afternoon, the ceremony was probably over. I wondered if she looked beautiful. I hoped she did. No matter how badly she'd hurt me, I still wanted her to have a happy life. That's the strange thing about loving someone for so many years. The love doesn't disappear just because they stop returning it. Daisy suddenly lifted her head. A moment later, I heard engines outside. Not one vehicle. Several. I looked through the front window. 6 black SUVs rolled slowly into my driveway. Men in immaculate dark uniforms stepped out in perfect formation. One approached the porch while the others remained by the vehicles. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate strikes. I opened the door. The officer removed his cap. Miss Margaret Collins? Yes. He bowed his head slightly. His Majesty King William IV respectfully requests your presence immediately. For the second time that day, I couldn't find a single word to say. I stared at the officer for several seconds before I finally managed to speak. I'm sorry, who? His Majesty King William IV, ma'am. He said it as calmly as someone giving directions to the post office. I looked past him at the row of black SUVs parked in front of my little ranch house. 2 neighbors had already stepped onto their porches. Mrs. Henderson, who never missed anything happening on our street, was pretending to water flowers that had clearly been watered an hour earlier. There had to be some mistake. I'm afraid you've got the wrong Maggie Collins. The officer gave me a polite smile. Are you Margaret Ann Collins, born August 14th, 1986? I blinked. Yes. Then we're at the correct address. Daisy nudged against my leg, wagging her tail as if unexpected royal visitors were an everyday occurrence. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, can someone please tell me what's going on? I'm afraid His Majesty would prefer to explain personally. That sentence somehow made the situation even stranger. I glanced down at myself. Faded blue jeans, an old Asheville High School faculty t-shirt, gardening gloves sticking out of my back pocket. I'm not exactly dressed for royalty. The officer looked completely unfazed. His Majesty specifically requested that you come exactly as you are. That answer stayed with me. Exactly as you are. Not dressed up. Not polished. Just me. I asked if I could at least change my shoes. He nodded. Of course. 5 minutes later, I locked the front door, clipped Daisy's leash into Mrs. Henderson's waiting hands, and climbed into the back seat of one of the SUVs. Mrs. Henderson leaned toward the window. Maggie... I know. What in the world is happening? I wish I could tell you. She laughed nervously. When you get back, you're telling me everything. If I understand any of it myself. The convoy pulled away. As we drove toward Asheville Regional Airport, I kept waiting for someone to explain. No one did. The officers were courteous but quiet. One finally offered me a bottle of water. Another asked if I needed anything to eat. Otherwise, the ride passed in complete silence. When we arrived at the airport, I expected a commercial terminal. Instead, the convoy drove through a private security gate. Waiting on the runway was a sleek white aircraft with no airline logo. Just a small royal crest near the door. The officer noticed me staring. This aircraft belongs to the royal household. I shook my head. This is officially the strangest day of my life. For the first time, he smiled. I imagine it is. The flight to Boston took less than 2 hours. No reporters, no photographers, only 3 members of the royal staff. One elderly woman introduced herself as Eleanor. She poured me tea herself. You've had a difficult day. You could say that. She hesitated before speaking again. His Majesty has been quite concerned since this afternoon. Concerned about what? You. I nearly spilled my tea. Me. She simply nodded. Nothing more. By the time we landed, dusk had settled over Massachusetts. I expected flashing cameras outside. Instead, another convoy met us and drove through quiet roads lined with old stone walls and towering maple trees. Eventually, we entered a large estate surrounded by iron gates. It wasn't the wedding venue. It felt more like a historic American mansion than a palace. Elegant, private, peaceful. Inside, everything was surprisingly understated. Dark wood, family portraits, fresh flowers. No gold chandeliers, no unnecessary luxury. The place felt lived in. One of the staff members led me into a library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covered every wall. A fire crackled softly despite the cool spring evening. Standing beside the fireplace was a tall man in his 70s, wearing a navy suit instead of ceremonial robes. He turned as I entered. His face looked remarkably ordinary. Kind eyes, silver hair, gentle posture. Nothing like the intimidating kings I'd imagined from movies. He walked toward me before anyone could announce my name. "Miss Collins." I nodded awkwardly. "Your Majesty." Then something happened that completely caught me off guard. He reached out and shook my hand. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't exactly given much choice." A tiny smile crossed his face. "I suppose not." He motioned toward 2 comfortable chairs. "Please sit." No throne, no formal ceremony. Just 2 people talking. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked one simple question. "Why were you absent from today's wedding?" I looked at him in disbelief. "I wasn't absent." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "I wasn't invited." Silence settled over the room. The king's expression changed almost immediately. Not anger, confusion. He slowly folded his hands together. "I'm sorry. I received no invitation. Our records indicate you declined." "I never declined anything." He looked toward a woman standing near the doorway. "Rebecca." She opened a folder. "According to the wedding office, Miss Collins expressed appreciation but was unable to attend." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. "I never spoke to anyone from your wedding office." The king watched my face carefully. "You personally spoke with the bride." "Yes. What exactly did she say?" I hadn't planned to repeat Olivia's words. Saying them aloud somehow made them more real. But something about the king's expression made lying feel impossible. I took a slow breath. She said. My voice caught. That I was an embarrassment. The room became absolutely still. No one moved. Rebecca quietly closed the folder in her hands. The king looked down for several long seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened. "I am deeply sorry," I shrugged. "You don't owe me an apology." "Perhaps not." He looked directly into my eyes. "But someone does." He asked if I'd mind answering a few more questions. Not about the wedding. About my family. For nearly an hour we talked. About Mom. Dad's stroke. Working 3 jobs. Olivia's college tuition. The second mortgage. The years that simply disappeared while I tried to keep our family together. I wasn't complaining. Just answering questions. Several times the king interrupted only to clarify dates. "How old were you when your mother died?" 20. "And your sister?" 14. "You postponed graduate school?" "Yes." "You never returned?" I smiled faintly. Life had other plans. At one point he quietly stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the gardens. He stayed there for nearly a minute. Without turning around, he asked, "Do you still love your sister?" That question hurt more than all the others, because I didn't have to think about the answer. "Yes." I looked down at my hands. I wish I didn't. A gentle knock interrupted us. Rebecca returned carrying several old photographs. I frowned. "They're mine." One of the officers had apparently brought the photo album from my house. The king carefully turned each page. Christmas mornings, school plays, college graduation, hospital rooms, birthday cakes, camping trips. Every photograph told the same quiet story. Olivia stood in the center. I stood somewhere nearby, watching, helping, smiling, never asking for attention. Finally, the king closed the album. He exhaled slowly. "I believe I understand now." "I don't." He looked at me with unmistakable sadness. "No, Miss Collins. I believe you've spent 20 years making sure someone else could become extraordinary." His words caught me completely off guard. I didn't think about it like that. Most generous people never do. I stood. "I appreciate your kindness, Your Majesty, but I think I'd like to go home now. I don't belong here." He stood as well. Then he said something I never expected. "Neither do lies." Before I could respond, he continued. "There is still a reception taking place." I nodded uncertainly. I know. I would consider it a personal favor. He paused. If you would accompany me. My stomach tightened. You want me to go to the reception? Yes. I don't think that's a good idea. I do. What if Olivia doesn't want me there? For the first time all evening, the king's expression became firm. This evening, Miss Collins. That decision is no longer hers. He offered me his arm. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then, with my heart pounding harder than it had all day, I accepted. The drive to the reception took less than 20 minutes. I spent every one of those minutes wondering whether I should ask the driver to turn around. I don't belong there, I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else. The king, seated across from me in the spacious SUV, looked up from the folder resting on his lap. You've said that twice. Because it's true. He smiled, not the polite smile he'd worn all evening, but something warmer. Miss Collins, sometimes the people who belong somewhere the most are the ones convinced they don't. I looked out the window. Boston's evening lights reflected across the Charles River as we passed downtown. Police motorcycles cleared intersections ahead of us, but the streets remained surprisingly calm. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a carefully organized security operation. I still couldn't believe I was in the middle of it. The reception was being held inside the Boston Public Library's historic McKim building. I recognized it immediately. I'd visited years earlier during a summer vacation with Dad and Olivia. Dad had loved old architecture. He'd insisted we spend an afternoon walking through the marble hallways instead of shopping on Newbury Street. I remembered Olivia complaining that it was boring. Dad had laughed. One day you'll appreciate beautiful things. The memory made my chest tighten. The convoy entered through a private entrance beneath the building. Royal security moved with quiet efficiency. No shouting. No rushing. Every person seemed to know exactly where to stand. Rebecca approached with a garment bag. We've brought you something appropriate for the evening. I hesitated. I really don't need an expensive gown. She smiled. It isn't. Inside hung a simple navy blue dress. Elegant. Classic. Nothing flashy. Nothing that looked like it belonged to a princess. It looked like something a high school English teacher might choose for a retirement banquet. I actually laughed. How did you know my size? Rebecca grinned. Teachers are surprisingly easy to research. For the first time all day, I laughed without forcing it. 20 minutes later, I stood outside enormous bronze doors with the king beside me. Music drifted through the entrance, a jazz orchestra. Soft conversation. The clinking of glasses. My hands suddenly felt cold. I can't do this. The king looked toward me. What are you afraid of? I don't want to ruin her wedding. You won't. What if she hates me even more? He answered gently. That choice belongs to her. Then the doors opened. Everything stopped. I don't mean it became quieter. I mean it stopped. The orchestra fell silent in the middle of a song. Servers froze where they stood. Nearly 400 guests turned toward the entrance almost at the same time. Camera flashes erupted across the ballroom. The king entered first. I walked half a step behind him. I wanted to disappear. Instead, every eye in the room found me. The ballroom itself was breathtaking. Towering marble columns, crystal chandeliers, tables decorated with white roses and candles. The kind of place I'd only ever seen in magazines sitting on the checkout rack at Ingles. Then I saw Olivia. She was standing beside Prince Alexander holding a champagne glass. The color drained from her face so quickly I honestly thought she might faint. She whispered something I couldn't hear. Alexander looked from her to me, then back again. His expression wasn't angry. It was confused, deeply confused. The king walked directly toward the newlyweds. Guests stepped aside without being asked. When he reached them, he embraced Alexander. Then he turned, not toward Olivia, toward me. He extended his hand. Miss Margaret Collins. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I somehow reached him. The king faced the guests. His voice carried easily through the silent ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, it has come to my attention that someone very important was absent from today's ceremony. I wanted to interrupt him, to tell him it wasn't necessary, but the words wouldn't come. He continued, I would like you all to meet the woman whose sacrifices helped make today's celebration possible. The room remained absolutely still. I heard someone quietly set down a wine glass. Another person cleared his throat. No one spoke. Alexander stepped forward. Your Majesty. The king nodded. I believe there is someone you should meet properly. Alexander looked at me. His eyes were kind. Nothing about him matched the cold, arrogant prince I'd imagined. He offered his hand. I'm Alexander. I shook it. Maggie, his forehead wrinkled slightly. Olivia's sister. Yes. He slowly turned toward Olivia. You told me she couldn't come. Olivia didn't answer. You said she was traveling. Still nothing. He looked back at me. I'm very sorry. Those 3 words hit me harder than I expected, because they sounded sincere. Across the room, whispers spread from table to table. I caught pieces of conversations. That's her sister. I didn't even know she had family. What happened? 2 older women seated near the orchestra looked at me with expressions that reminded me of retired teachers. One quietly reached over and squeezed the other's hand. Somehow that tiny gesture nearly made me cry. Rebecca approached Alexander carrying a thin folder. He opened it while standing only a few feet away. As he read, his face changed. Confusion. Disbelief. Then sadness. He looked up. Maggie, you paid Olivia's tuition. Mostly. You cared for your father. Yes. You postponed graduate school. I did. He turned another page. You took out a second mortgage. I shrugged uncomfortably. It worked out. It says here you worked 3 jobs. Only for a while. He closed the folder very slowly. You never told me any of this. I didn't know you. I mean, Olivia. I didn't answer. There wasn't much left to say. Then something happened that broke the tension in the most unexpected way. An elderly senator from Vermont who had apparently arrived late and missed most of what had happened, walked straight toward me with a broad smile. Madam Ambassador, I blinked. I'm sorry. He reached out enthusiastically. I've been hoping we'd finally meet. Before I could explain, Rebecca leaned over and whispered something into his ear. The senator's eyes widened. Oh, he looked embarrassed. I'm terribly sorry. I laughed. Honestly laughed. No harm done. He chuckled. Well, he pointed toward the king. Judging by tonight, you're still more important than I realized. Even the king laughed. The sound spread through the room like permission. People smiled. The tension eased just enough for everyone to breathe again. But not Olivia. She stood completely still. Her bouquet had been placed on a nearby table hours earlier. Her hands were trembling. Finally, she walked toward us. She stopped only a few feet away. Maggie, her voice was barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? I looked at her for several seconds. Then I answered honestly. I was invited. She closed her eyes. For just a moment. When she opened them again, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not confidence. Not pride. Fear. Behind us, the orchestra remained silent. No one had resumed eating. No one wanted to miss what happened next. Prince Alexander turned slowly toward his new wife. His voice stayed calm. Almost too calm. Olivia! He paused. Why didn't you tell me about your sister? She opened her mouth. But no words came out. No one moved. The ballroom, which had been full of laughter only minutes earlier, had fallen into a silence so complete I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above us. Alexander looked from Olivia to me, then back again. His voice remained steady. I'm asking you a simple question. He glanced at the folder Rebecca had handed him. Why didn't you tell me Maggie raised you? Olivia swallowed. I didn't think it mattered. The words hung in the air. I watched Alexander's face tighten. It mattered enough that you hid it. She looked around the room as though searching for someone to rescue her. No one did. King William stepped forward, but he wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed disappointed. I believe, he said calmly, that tonight should continue as a celebration. He paused. But celebrations should never be built on deception. No one argued. Not a single person. I wanted to disappear. That surprised me. After everything Olivia had done, I thought I'd feel satisfied. Instead, I felt tired. The last thing I wanted was to become the center of attention on the happiest day of her life. I leaned toward the king. Your Majesty. He looked at me. I think I've made your point. I'd really like to leave. He studied my face for a moment. Then he quietly asked, Are you leaving because you're uncomfortable? Or because you're protecting your sister? The question caught me off guard, because the answer was obvious. Even now, I was trying to protect her. I let out a slow breath. I honestly don't know. The king gave a small nod. I thought as much. Alexander turned fully toward Olivia. When did you decide not to invite Maggie? Olivia hesitated. A few months ago. A few months. She nodded without looking at him. My advisors were helping with the guest list. So they told you to exclude your only sister. No. Then who did? She finally met his eyes. I did. A murmur rippled through the room. Not loud. just enough to remind everyone they had witnessed the admission. Alexander's shoulders slumped. I don't understand. You wouldn't. Help me understand. Olivia closed her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. I spent years trying to leave my old life behind. Our old life wasn't something to be ashamed of. You didn't live my life. I almost interrupted, but I didn't. She deserved the chance to explain herself, even if I didn't agree. She looked around the ballroom. The magazines. The interviews. The photographers. They kept asking where I came from. She laughed once. A sad, nervous laugh. They wanted some perfect story. Alexander frowned. So, I didn't think a teacher from North Carolina living in a modest little house fit that story. Someone at a nearby table quietly gasped. Olivia continued. I thought if they met Maggie... She stopped. The room waited. I thought they'd see where I came from. I felt something inside me sink. Not because she'd admitted the truth, because she actually believed it. Alexander spoke softly. They would have. Olivia looked hopeful for just a second. Then he finished. They would have seen the woman who made you possible. Her shoulders dropped. I fell in love with the woman who told me family meant everything. He shook his head slowly. I never imagined you meant everyone except your sister. One of the royal photographers quietly lowered his camera. No one wanted to take pictures anymore. Across the ballroom, waiters stood motionless beside silver trays. The orchestra members remained seated with their instruments resting in their laps. The celebration had become something else entirely. King William stepped toward the microphone near the dance floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture anyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't keep you long. He rested one hand lightly on the podium. This evening has reminded me of something my late father often said. Titles may be inherited. Character never is. He looked across the room. Many people spend years earning wealth. Some spend years earning influence. But very few spend years quietly carrying another person's burdens without asking for recognition. Then he looked directly at me. Miss Collins appears to be one of those rare people. I wished the floor would open beneath my feet. Several guests began applauding. It started with one table, then another. Soon nearly the entire ballroom was clapping. Not loudly, not dramatically, just warmly, respectfully. I had never felt so uncomfortable in my life. An older woman wearing a silver evening gown approached me after the applause faded. She introduced herself as Lady Catherine, one of the king's longtime charity advisors. She smiled kindly. My husband passed away several years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. She squeezed my hand. I recognized something in you tonight. What was that? The look of someone who's spent most of her life taking care of everyone else. I smiled weakly. I suppose that's true. She chuckled. You know what happens to women like us? What? We become so accustomed to standing in the background that we forget we deserve to be seen. For reasons I couldn't explain. Those words nearly brought me to tears. Across the ballroom, Olivia was crying openly now. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. She walked toward me slowly. Not like the confident executive who had closed multi-million-dollar real estate deals, just like my little sister. Maggie. I looked at her. I'm sorry. I believed she meant it. At least partly. But apologies don't erase years. Or words, especially certain words. She reached for my hand. I let her hold it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know. I was ashamed. I nodded. I know. But I wasn't ashamed of you. That caught my attention. I was ashamed? She looked down. Where I came from. There it was. The real truth? Not me. Not my clothes. Not my little house. She had been running away from her own past. And because I reminded her of it, she pushed me away too. I suddenly didn't feel angry anymore. Just sad. Very, very sad. I spent 20 years trying to give you opportunities, I said quietly. I never once thought I was giving you something to hide. She cried harder. I know. I wanted people to think I built everything myself. I smiled sadly. Most people who truly build something never need to say they did. She lowered her head. I'm so sorry. I thought about everything that had happened. The missed phone calls. The unanswered texts. The empty mailbox. The words she'd spoken over the phone. You're an embarrassment. For weeks I'd imagined telling her exactly how much those words had hurt. Now that the opportunity was finally here, I couldn't. Because looking at her, she already knew. Nothing I could say would make her feel worse than she felt in that moment. So instead I took both of her hands. I forgive you. She looked up in surprise. I continued before she could speak. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't rebuild trust overnight. And it doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. She nodded through tears. I understand. But carrying anger around for the rest of my life? I smiled gently. That would only hurt me. She wrapped her arms around me. For a second I hesitated. Then I hugged my little sister. Not because she'd earned it. Because I didn't want bitterness to become the last chapter of our family's story. Around us the ballroom remained completely quiet. Even the king looked away for a moment, giving us the privacy of strangers. When we finally stepped apart, Alexander walked over. He looked at me with genuine respect. I hope, he said, that someday you'll allow me the chance to know the sister Olivia should have introduced me to from the very beginning. I smiled. I'd like that. For the first time that evening, it felt like the truth had finally entered the room. People often ask whether life changes in a single moment. I used to think that only happened in movies. Now I know better. Sometimes it isn't the dramatic moments that change you. It's what happens after everyone goes home. The reception slowly found its rhythm again. Not the way it had before. Something had shifted. Conversations became quieter. People laughed again, but more gently, as though everyone understood they'd witnessed something deeply personal. The orchestra eased back into playing soft jazz. Waiters resumed serving dinner. Someone dimmed the lights over the dance floor. The wedding continued. Life has a way of insisting on moving forward. Alexander walked over to me carrying 2 cups of coffee. I had someone ask what you usually drink. I smiled. Black. I guessed correctly. He handed me 1 cup. For what it's worth. I owe you an apology. I shook my head. You didn't know. I should have. You trusted the woman you loved. He nodded. I did. And I still do. He paused. But trust also means asking difficult questions. For the next half hour, we sat together in a quiet corner of the ballroom. No cameras. No royal staff hovering nearby. Just 2 people trying to understand how an ordinary American family had arrived at such an extraordinary evening. He asked about my students. I told him about Tyler, who finally finished reading To Kill a Mockingbird after insisting for 2 months that he'd hate it. About Emily, who wanted to become the first lawyer in her family. About Friday football games, faculty meetings that always ran too long, and teenagers who somehow believed teachers couldn't use smartphones. Alexander laughed. I expected stories about royalty. You asked about my life? I did. And your life sounds remarkably happy. I looked down at my coffee. It usually is. Before the evening ended, King William asked if he could introduce me to several people. I almost refused. Instead, I spent the next hour talking with veterans, librarians, teachers, business owners, and volunteers from charities across the United States. No one cared what I was wearing. No one asked how much money I made. They asked about books, schools, community gardens. One retired couple from Ohio spent 15 minutes telling me about the little free libraries they'd built around their town. Those conversations felt far more important than standing beside royalty. Later that night before I left, Olivia found me standing alone on an outdoor terrace overlooking Copley Square. The city lights shimmered against the wet pavement after a brief spring shower. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, she leaned against the stone railing beside me. Do you remember Dad bringing us here? I smiled. The library. You complained the whole afternoon. She laughed through a sniffle. I was awful. You were 14. I've been awful longer than that. I turned toward her. You've made some terrible choices. I know. I don't think you're a terrible person. She covered her face with one hand. I wanted everyone to admire me. They already did. Not enough. Her answer was painfully honest. I kept thinking if I reached one more level, made one more deal, met one more important person, I'd finally feel like I belonged. She looked directly at me, but I never did. I nodded slowly. Because belonging isn't something other people give you. She wiped her eyes. I think I understand that now. The next morning I flew home to Asheville. This time there were no black SUVs waiting, no royal escort. Just a quiet commercial flight with families heading home after vacations. Exactly the way I preferred it. When I walked through the front door, Daisy nearly knocked me over. Mrs. Henderson hurried across the lawn before I'd even unpacked my suitcase. She folded her arms. Well, I laughed. Put the coffee on. We spent nearly 3 hours at my kitchen table. I left out the private conversations. Some moments belonged only to the people who lived them. But I told her enough that she finally leaned back in her chair and said, "You know what impresses me most." "What?" "You came home exactly the same person." I thought about that all afternoon. Maybe she was right. Or maybe I had changed in ways that weren't immediately visible. School started again on Monday. By second period, my students were already whispering. One of them cautiously raised his hand. "Ms. Collins." "Yes. Were you on the news?" The entire classroom turned toward me. I smiled. For about 30 seconds. A boy in the back grinned. My grandma recorded it. The room burst into laughter. I couldn't help laughing, too. Then I picked up a copy of The Great Gatsby. All right. Enough excitement. Let's talk about people pretending to be someone they're not. The class laughed even harder. It turned out to be one of the best discussions we'd had all year. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email. Not something prepared by palace staff. An actual handwritten letter. It was from King William. Inside was a simple invitation. He was helping launch a literacy partnership between schools in the United States and Norhaven. He wondered whether I'd consider serving as a volunteer advisor. No salary. No title. Just helping children discover books. I smiled the moment I finished reading. That sounded like something worth saying yes to. Olivia called every Sunday after that. At first, the conversations lasted only 5 minutes, then 10, eventually an hour. Trust didn't magically return. It was rebuilt the same way an old farmhouse is repaired after a storm. One careful board at a time. Alexander called occasionally too. Not because he had to, because he genuinely wanted to know the woman who had shaped the person he'd married. The first Christmas after the wedding, they came to Asheville. No photographers. No security spectacle. Just the 3 of us decorating sugar cookies in my kitchen while Daisy waited hopefully beneath the table for something to fall. Alexander proved surprisingly terrible at frosting Christmas trees. Olivia laughed so hard she nearly cried. For the first time in many years, it sounded like my little sister again. Looking back now, people sometimes assume the greatest reward was being recognized by a king. It wasn't. The greatest reward was realizing I no longer needed recognition from anyone. Not from strangers. Not from magazines. Not even from my own family. I'd spent years measuring my worth by how much I could do for someone else. That night in Boston taught me something I should have learned long before. Real dignity isn't something another person can give you, and it isn't something they can take away. You carry it with you every single day in the quiet choices no one else notices. I still teach English. I still shop at Ingles. I still buy flowers at the Saturday market. My house is the same little ranch with the old oak floors. And every spring the roses bloom along the back fence exactly as they always have. The difference is that now when I look at them, I no longer wonder whether my life was ordinary. I know it wasn't. If this story reminded you that quiet acts of love matter more than titles or applause, I hope you'll carry that thought with you today. And if you've ever been overlooked, remember that your value has never depended on whether someone else recognized it. Thank you for spending this time with me.